Everybody, welcome to the Vibe Coding Cookbook YouTube channel. Vibe Coding Cookbook is a website that is dedicated to compiling and explaining examples using all of the automation and vibe coding tools that exist today. If you like this kind of content, please subscribe to our YouTube and our newsletter for weekly examples that you can use to become more effective at using these tools. In today's video, we're going to look at a situation that commonly shows up as part of a larger automation. And this is the case when you call an API using n8n and you want to store the data that comes back from the API in Airtable. Specifically, we're going to look at the case that the data that you want to store is part of an array in the response from the API, and you want to create a record in Airtable for each element in that array. Now, if terms like array, API, HTTP are not familiar to you, we have explanations of all of these on the site, so go check that out. But I'm going to assume you know what these terms mean for this video. All right, let's get started. So we're going to look at two examples today. The first is when the full API response itself is an array. And in the second example, the array that we're interested in is nested inside of the full API response. These are going to show up slightly differently in n8n, and it's going to let us learn something about how n8n models data, and it will require a slightly different solution in each case. But let's just go ahead and get started with the first example. So for the first example, we're going to use the official joke API, and they have an endpoint here /random10 that gives you 10 random jokes. So you can try this in your browser. We'll link to it in the description of this video. If I refresh, I'm going to get a different 10 random jokes. And what we want to do is store the setup and the punchline in Airtable, using n8n to fetch the response and go write the data to Airtable. So the first step is going to be setting up our Airtable table. So I'm going to move over to Airtable here. I've already created a base Vibe Coding Cookbook Edition 1, and this is the default table that it gives me. So let's rename the table Jokes. And then we need to set up the columns to be correct for the data that we want to store. So let's take a look at the API response again. I'm going to store the ID, the setup, and the punchline, and I'll ignore the type for this example. So let's go ahead and rename this column to API ID, and it's going to be a number with 0 decimal places. Then I'm going to need a column for setup, and we'll say single line text for that one. And then punchline for the third. Again, single line text. And then these final 3 columns here I can just delete because we don't need them. All right, so this looks good. We're going to write for each element in this response, each joke, we want to create a row in this table. So before we move over to n8n, I'm going to delete the empty rows. And now we are ready to go set up our n8n automation. So in n8n, I've created a Vibe Coding Cookbook project, and let's open this one, Store Jokes, to talk through our first example. So this is what it looks like when you open a workflow for the first time. It's blank. We're going to have to create our first step, which is always the trigger. Trigger is how an n8n automation gets run, and in this case we'll just trigger it manually since it's a simple example. Then the first real step here, we need to call our API. So we're going to use an HTTP request node, and when this opens up, we're going to do GET request, and I need the URL for the endpoint. Now, this is a simple example API, so we don't need to worry about authentication or sending any additional kind of information. So at this point, I can just click execute step and test the node. And we see we get the same array with 10 random jokes as output of this HTTP request node. Now, as a final step, I'm going to give this a more descriptive name. So let's say call jokes API. All right. Then after we have the data from the API, now we need to go write this to Airtable. So I'm going to add an Airtable node. In this case, we're going to be creating records. So I'm going to select create a record. And now n8n will show me the output of the previous node as input. So I have the 10 jokes that I want to store here in the input tab. And then I need to fill out the configuration for this Airtable node. So first up is the credentials. I've already went ahead and created credentials that allow my n8n account to talk to Airtable. If you don't know how to do that, we'll have a write-up for that as well on our site. It's basically just tedious and straightforward. So I created it ahead of time for the sake of keeping this video a little bit short. All right, for resource, we're working with record rather than a base. We're trying to create records in the table, so resource should be record. Operation is create, and now I need to tell n8n which base and which table to write the records in. So base, we're going to choose from list, select my base, and then select my jokes table. So this n8n node will automatically pull the different columns from the table that you select. And now we need to map the fields from the input to the columns here in the Airtable node. And n8n will let you do this by just dragging the fields from the left-hand side. So the ID in the element should go in the API ID column. Setup goes to setup, and punchline goes to punchline. All right, at this point, this looks good. So I'm going to click execute step, and let's see if it works. As soon as this is finished executing, I can come over here, and I see that the jokes were all written to the Airtable table. All right, as a final step, I'm going to try to run the whole workflow from start to finish on its own. So let's delete these so that we have a clean table. Come back to n8n, and then I'm going to click execute workflow so that all of these nodes run at one time. And let's go over to Airtable, and I can see that the writing is in progress. All right, so that covers our first example here, which is when the full API response is itself an array. Now, in our second example, I'll give you a preview here. I'll explain what this API is in a moment, but notice that the array in this response is not the full response, it's actually one field in the response. So I'm going to take this as an opportunity to talk about n8n items and how n8n models data from node to node. So if you look at your automation here, you're going to see above the connections that they're telling us there's one item between this node to this node, and then 10 items between the call jokes API and this create record node. So in n8n, you have several nodes, and nodes pass data between themselves, and n8n calls the data that is passed items. And typically, each node will run one time for every single item that it receives as input. So if we open up this Airtable node here, we can see the input is 10 items, and that's because there's 10 different elements in the array that we are providing as input. So this create record step is going to run one time for every single item that it provides it as input, that you provide as input. So keep that in mind as we go through our second example. We're going to see a bit of a tricky difference between the two, but let's go ahead and explain what this second API is that we're going to use for our example. So our second API is the dog API, another free API. Link is in the description. And they have this endpoint /API/breed/terrier/list. And this will list all of the different subtypes of the terrier dog breed. So here we get American Terrier, Australian Terrier, Bedlington Terrier, etc. And in this example, our goal is to write one record for each of these subtypes in Airtable. All right, so we're going to start this in the same way. We're going to create a new table in our Airtable base. We're going to name this table Terriers. And in this case, since the response is simple, I'm just going to have one column, which is going to be the subtype of Terrier. So I'm going to rename this column subtype. Again, it's going to be single line text. And then I'm just going to go delete the rest of the columns. And then let's delete our blank rows. All right, so the goal of this next n8n automation is going to be to create one subtype record for each of the subtypes that appears in this message array. So we're going to approach this by basically setting up the same example that we did in our first automation, and then we're going to have a look and see how it differs when we get to the Airtable step. So let's open up this store terriers automation. Again, we're going to trigger it manually to start. And we need an HTTP request node so that we can fetch the data from the API. So let's copy this URL, paste it here. Again, we don't need any kind of authentication or additional parameters, so we're just going to click execute step. And we see the same response here as the output of this node. All right, so let's follow the same strategy as before. We're going to create an Airtable node, create a record, credentials are set up, resources record, operation is create. We're going to choose the same base, and now our terriers table will appear. And the node fetches the column subtype. All right, so at this point, if we tried to do the same thing as before, we might drag message here into subtype and click execute step, and let's see what happens. We actually get an error from Airtable, and that error says that the field subtype cannot accept the provided value. And that's because JSON.message here, which corresponds to this message field, is an array. But in our Airtable column, we need each record to be a single line text. So what we really want to do is create one Airtable record for this American element, one for this Australian element, etc. But because the array is nested inside of the API response. See if we come back here, the outermost squiggly braces tells us this is one JSON object, and the array is this message field. That means n8n is treating this as one single item. So this create record Airtable node is only going to run one time rather than the 10 times in our first example. So what we need to do here is somehow split this array into multiple items, one item for each of the pieces of data that we want to put in Airtable. And the way that n8n lets you do this is with a different type of node that's going to sit in between the HTTP request and create a record. So we're actually going to sever that connection. And the node that we want is called split out. So I'm going to add a split out node. And you see the configuration here, it says fields to split out. So this node takes this single item as input, and I'm going to split out the message field. And let's execute step and see what happens. Now you can see I've got 23 items as output. One item for each element in this message array. So this looks a lot more like what we want. Now we can put these 23 items as input to the Airtable node, and Airtable is going to create a record for each separate item. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to add this connection from the split out node to the create record node. Open this back up. Now this JSON.message is now going to work as the expression here because we have 23 items, each with a message key. And so this node is going to run 23 times, once on each item. So let's click execute step, and if we go back to Airtable, we can see that n8n is writing the values for us just like we want. And that's finished. All right, and then finally, we're going to test this in one go and run the entire workflow in one shot. So let's click execute workflow, come back to Airtable, and we can see that it's working the same as before. Awesome. Hope that helped you out. Leave any comments in the YouTube video. We will answer every question. Don't forget to subscribe to YouTube and our newsletter, and we will see you next time.